Margaret Whitfield had been married to Walter for 11 years, and in all that time, she had never once felt ashamed of him, until the morning she stood frozen in the marble lobby of Ashford Tower, watching the most powerful CEO in the city walk straight past 300 people, ignore his own board of directors, and stop in front of her husband, the janitor, to shake his hand and say, "Good morning, boss." If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in second chances, and in the quiet dignity of people the world overlooks, I want you to like this video, leave a comment below, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel, because stories like this one are why we do what we do. Our community has grown because of people like you, who still believe that love and humility can outlast pride, and I promise you, this story will remind you why that belief matters. Now let's begin. Margaret had woken up that morning the same way she woke up every morning for the past decade, early, before the sun had fully climbed over the rooftops of their modest neighborhood, already running through the mental list of things that needed doing. She made coffee for herself and tea for Walter, because he never could stomach coffee, not since his stomach ulcers had flared up years ago during what he vaguely called his old job days, a phrase he used so rarely and so carefully that Margaret had long since stopped asking what it meant. She used to ask, in the early years of their marriage, gently probing at the edges of his past, but Walter would only smile that soft, tired smile of his and say, "The past isn't as interesting as the present, Maggie. Let's just live in today." And because she loved him, and because he was kind to her in every single way that mattered, she let it go. She let it go for 11 years. Walter Whitfield was, by every visible measure, an unremarkable man. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation, the same brown work boots with the sole starting to peel at the left heel, and he drove a 15-year-old pickup truck that rattled every time it idled at a red light. He worked nights and early mornings as a janitor at Ashford Tower, the gleaming 52-story headquarters of Ashford Global Enterprises, one of the largest financial and technology conglomerates in the country. He mopped floors, emptied trash bins, cleaned executive washrooms, and polished the elevator doors until they shone like mirrors. He never complained. He never seemed embarrassed. He came home every day around 10 in the morning smelling faintly of industrial cleaner, and he would kiss Margaret on the forehead, eat a small breakfast, and sleep for a few hours before waking up to spend the rest of the afternoon with her, tending to their small garden, fixing things around the house, or simply sitting on the porch swing with her, saying very little, but somehow saying everything. Margaret loved him fiercely, in the quiet, weathered way that comes from years of shared mornings and shared silences. But love, as much as it can carry 2 people through hardship, cannot always shield them from the world's judgment, and Margaret had felt that judgment many times over the years. She remembered the Christmas party at her sister Louise's house 3 years ago, when Louise's husband, a mid-level manager at an insurance firm, had asked Walter what he did for a living, and when Walter answered plainly, "I'm a janitor," the room had gone quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when people don't know whether to be polite or pity you. Louise had laughed a little too loudly to cover the silence and said, "Well, someone's got to do it," and Margaret had felt her face burn with an emotion she hated herself for feeling, not embarrassment for Walter, but a strange, twisting shame that she couldn't quite name, the shame of loving a man the world had quietly decided not to respect. She never told Walter about that shame. She buried it deep, the way people bury the things they aren't proud of feeling, and she told herself that it didn't matter what her family thought, that Walter's job didn't define his worth, that a man who came home every day with clean hands and a good heart was worth 10 men in expensive suits. She believed this. She truly did. But belief and feeling are not always the same thing, and there were nights when she lay awake wondering what her life might have looked like if Walter had been something more, a manager, an accountant, anything with a title that made people nod respectfully instead of offering that practiced, polite half-smile reserved for people they considered beneath them. It was on an ordinary Tuesday in the middle of March, with the kind of pale, watery sunlight that filters weakly through late winter clouds, that everything Margaret thought she understood about her husband's life began to unravel. She had gone downtown that morning to Ashford Tower, not because she had any reason to be there, but because her niece, Eleanor, worked as a receptionist on the 14th floor and had invited her to lunch to celebrate a small promotion. Margaret had never once visited Walter's workplace in 11 years of marriage. It simply never occurred to her. His shifts were early and hers were spent managing the household and, more recently, caring for her aging mother 2 days a week. Their lives ran in parallel tracks that rarely intersected with the specific geography of his job. She arrived at Ashford Tower a full 20 minutes before her lunch appointment, and so she sat in the lobby, a vast cathedral-like space of gleaming marble floors, soaring glass ceilings, and a fountain in the center that trickled water over smooth black stones. She watched the flow of people moving through, men and women in tailored suits, clutching leather briefcases, walking with the brisk, self-important stride of people who believed their time was more valuable than anyone else's. She felt small in that lobby, the way she always felt small in spaces built for people with more money and more power than she would ever have, and she found herself thinking, with a small twinge of guilt, that this was the world Walter cleaned every single night while everyone else slept. And then she saw him. Walter was near the east wall, kneeling beside a marble pillar, carefully polishing a brass fixture with a soft cloth, his gray hair catching the light from the glass ceiling above. He hadn't seen her yet. He was fully absorbed in his work, the way he always was, moving with the quiet, unhurried precision of a man who took pride in things most people never noticed. Margaret felt a rush of tenderness looking at him, that same steady love she had felt for 11 years, and she was about to call out to him, to surprise him, when the elevator doors at the far end of the lobby slid open with a soft chime, and out stepped a man Margaret recognized instantly from the cover of business magazines and the evening news, Bradley Kensington, the CEO of Ashford Global Enterprises, a man whose name alone commanded boardrooms and whose net worth was estimated in the billions. Bradley Kensington was tall, silver-haired, dressed in a charcoal suit so perfectly tailored it seemed to have been sewn directly onto his frame. He moved through the lobby with the effortless authority of a man who had never once in his adult life had to wait for anything, flanked by 2 assistants who struggled to keep pace with his stride while scrolling through tablets and murmuring updates about his schedule. Every head in the lobby turned. Every conversation dropped to a hushed murmur. Employees straightened their posture. A young man in a suit nearly tripped over his own feet trying to get out of the CEO's path. And then, to Margaret's utter astonishment, Bradley Kensington stopped walking. He stopped in the middle of that vast lobby, in front of every single person watching, turned away from his assistants mid-sentence, and walked directly toward the marble pillar where Walter was kneeling. Margaret's heart began to pound in a way she couldn't explain, some instinctive animal sense that something important, something world-altering, was about to happen. Bradley Kensington crouched down slightly, an act so unexpected from a man of his stature that several onlookers actually gasped audibly, and extended his hand toward Walter. "Good morning, boss," Bradley Kensington said, his voice carrying clearly across the sudden silence of the lobby. "I was hoping I'd catch you before the board meeting. Do you have a few minutes? I could really use your read on something." Margaret's entire world tilted sideways. Walter looked up, and for the briefest moment, something flickered across his face, not surprise, not fear, but something closer to weary resignation, the look of a man who had been dreading a moment he knew was eventually coming. He stood slowly, wiping his hands on a cloth, and shook Bradley Kensington's hand with the easy familiarity of 2 men who had known each other for a very long time. "Of course, Bradley," Walter said, and his voice, carried none of the deference Margaret would have expected from a janitor addressing a billionaire CEO. It carried the calm, measured authority of someone entirely used to being listened to. Margaret sat frozen on the lobby bench, her lunch appointment with Eleanor completely forgotten, watching her husband of 11 years walk beside the most powerful man in the company toward a private elevator, the assistants trailing behind them, whispering urgently to each other. Just before the elevator doors closed, she saw Walter glance across the lobby, and their eyes met. For one suspended, agonizing second, Walter Whitfield looked at his wife with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It wasn't guilt exactly, and it wasn't quite fear, but it was something adjacent to both, the look of a man whose carefully constructed world had just cracked open in front of the one person he loved most. Then the elevator doors slid shut, and he was gone, swallowed up into the gleaming tower he supposedly only cleaned. Margaret sat there for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only minutes, her mind spinning through 11 years of memories, searching for cracks she might have missed, moments that suddenly made a strange, unsettling kind of sense. The way Walter sometimes spoke about business decisions with startling clarity during news broadcasts, the way he'd once corrected a financial advisor's math so effortlessly the man had stared at him in confusion, the way certain fine restaurants seemed to know him by name on the rare occasions they splurged on an anniversary dinner, the maitre d' greeting him with a warmth and familiarity that never quite matched a janitor's salary. She had noticed these things over the years, filed them away as small, harmless oddities, the way you notice a stray thread on a sweater without ever pulling it to see how much might unravel. Now she felt as though the entire sweater was coming apart in her hands. She did not go to lunch with her niece. She sent a quick, apologetic text claiming a sudden headache, and then she sat in her car in the parking garage of Ashford Tower for nearly 2 hours, staring blankly through the windshield, trying to reconcile the gentle, humble man who mopped floors and fixed leaky faucets with whatever version of Walter had just walked into a private elevator being called "boss" by a billionaire. When Walter came home that evening, later than usual, his uniform still on, his face pale and drawn in a way Margaret had rarely seen, she was sitting at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold, waiting for him. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her face. He knew immediately that she knew. "Maggie," he said softly, setting down his bag by the door, "I can explain." "Then explain," Margaret said, and her voice, to her own surprise, did not shake with anger so much as it trembled with hurt, a far more dangerous and difficult emotion to navigate. 11 years, Walter. 11 years I've been your wife. I have watched you scrub toilets and empty other people's trash and come home smelling like bleach, and I have never once been ashamed of that. Do you understand me? Never once. But I have felt ashamed of feeling ashamed, if that makes any sense, because some small ugly part of me sometimes wished you were something more, and I hated myself for it. And now I find out that you already were something more. That you've been lying to me, for 11 years? Walter sank into the chair across from her, his shoulders curving inward as though the weight of the truth was physically pressing down on him. I never lied to you, he said quietly. Not directly. I let you believe what you believed, because it was easier. Because it was what I wanted, Maggie. I wanted to be just a janitor to you. I wanted, for once in my life, to be loved for exactly what I did with my 2 hands and nothing else. That's not an answer, Margaret said. That's an excuse. Tell me who you actually are, Walter. Tell me right now, or I swear to God, I don't know what I'll do. And so Walter Whitfield told her. 22 years earlier, before Margaret had ever met him, Walter had been the founder and CEO of a small but rapidly growing logistics and supply chain technology company called Halloway Freight Solutions. He had built it from nothing, starting with a single delivery truck and a business plan scrawled on the back of a diner napkin, and through 15 years of relentless work, he had grown it into a company employing over 800 people, with contracts across half the country. He had been, by every measure, a wildly successful man, wealthy, respected, featured in trade publications, invited to speak at industry conferences. And then, in the span of 18 brutal months, he had lost almost everything. It began with his first wife, Deborah, whom Margaret had never known existed, who had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of ovarian cancer. Walter had poured every resource he had, financial, emotional, physical, into her treatment, flying her to specialists across the country, taking leaves of absence that left his company vulnerable to a hostile takeover attempt by a rival firm backed by a man named Reginald Cole, a former business partner Walter had once trusted like a brother. While Walter sat in hospital rooms holding his wife's hand through chemotherapy sessions, Reginald had been quietly buying up shares, whispering doubts into the ears of the board, painting Walter as a man too distracted, too emotionally compromised, to lead the company through its next growth phase. Deborah died in the spring, 11 months after her diagnosis. 6 weeks later, in a boardroom vote Walter hadn't even been well enough to properly fight. He was voted out of his own company by a board he had personally selected years earlier. Reginald Cole took over as CEO. The company was later sold to a larger conglomerate, and Walter, grieving and broken and utterly without the will to fight a legal battle he technically could have won, walked away with a settlement that, after debts and legal fees and the crushing weight of medical bills insurance hadn't covered, left him with almost nothing. He had lost his wife, his company, his identity, and his sense of purpose all within the same devastating year and a half. He described to Margaret, in a voice raw with a pain he had clearly never fully processed, how he had spiraled into a depression so consuming that he barely left his apartment for months, how the only thing that eventually pulled him out of it was, strangely enough, cleaning. A friend, worried about him, had gotten him a temporary janitorial job at a small office building, just to give him somewhere to be, something simple to do with his hands that required no decisions, no leadership, no risk of losing anything else that mattered. And Walter had discovered, to his own surprise, that there was a peculiar peace in it. Nobody expected anything from a janitor except clean floors. Nobody's livelihood depended on his decisions. Nobody would ever again look at him with the calculating eyes of a business partner deciding whether he was still useful. He had drifted from that first temporary job into a permanent position, and then, 3 years later, into the position at Ashford Tower, where, through a strange twist of fate, he discovered that Bradley Kensington, then a rising junior executive rather than the CEO he would eventually become, had once worked under Walter years earlier at Holloway Freight Solutions, back when Bradley was fresh out of business school and Walter had personally mentored him, teaching him everything he knew about leadership, integrity, and how to build something lasting. Bradley had recognized Walter instantly on his first week working the night shift at Ashford Tower, and rather than expose him, Bradley had quietly begun seeking him out during his early morning arrivals, initially out of respect and nostalgia, and then, over the years, out of genuine need, because Walter's business instincts, forged over 15 years of building a company from nothing, remained sharper than almost anyone else's in the building. Bradley had learned to trust Walter's judgment on complicated decisions more than he trusted his own board of directors, and their meetings, always brief, always private, always scheduled around Walter's cleaning shift, had become one of the quiet load-bearing pillars of Ashford Global Enterprises' continued success, invisible to everyone except the two men who knew the truth. "I met you 2 years after Deborah died," Walter said, his eyes glistening now with tears he was fighting to hold back. "I wasn't looking for anyone, Maggie. I wasn't looking for anything except a quiet life where nobody would ever again ask me to be somebody important. And then I met you, at your cousin's barbecue, and you were so warm, and so real, and you looked at me, just me, the man in the flannel shirt with cleaning supplies in his truck, and you didn't ask me a single question about my career or my prospects or what I used to be. You asked me if I liked dogs and whether I thought thunderstorms were beautiful or terrifying. And I fell in love with you precisely because you loved a version of me that had nothing to do with success or money or status. I was terrified that if you knew who I used to be, you'd start seeing me differently. You'd start wanting that man back, the man with the company and the money, instead of the man I actually am now. And I couldn't bear that, Maggie. I couldn't bear losing you the way I lost everything else." Margaret sat in silence for a long moment, tears sliding freely down her own cheeks now, the cold tea forgotten between her hands. The anger that had been building in her chest all afternoon was still there, tangled up with grief and confusion and something that felt uncomfortably close to guilt, because hadn't she, in her darkest, most shameful moments, secretly wished for exactly the version of Walter he had been so afraid of becoming again? Hadn't she felt that quiet, ugly shame at Louise's Christmas party, wishing her husband carried a more impressive title? And now here he was, confessing that he had hidden an entire empire's worth of success from her precisely because he feared she would only love him for it. "You should have trusted me," Margaret finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "That's what hurts the most, Walter. Not that you used to be rich. Not that you're some secret genius who mentors CEOs on his lunch break. It's that you didn't trust me enough to believe that I loved you, all of you, the whole complicated, wounded, brilliant, humble mess of you, and that I would have loved you exactly the same whether you were sweeping floors or running a Fortune 500 company. You made a decision about who I was without ever giving me the chance to prove it to you." Walter reached across the table, his weathered hand trembling slightly as it covered hers. "You're right," he said. "You're absolutely right, and I am so sorry, Maggie. I built you a smaller life than the one we could have had, not because I didn't trust the world, but because I didn't trust myself not to lose everything again. Every time I built something, it got taken from me. My company. My wife. My sense of who I was. I told myself that if I never built anything again, I could never lose it again. But I never stopped to think about what I might be losing right now, every single day, by not fully trusting you with the truth." The following days were among the hardest of Margaret's life. She moved through the house in a strange fog, cooking meals mechanically, sitting beside Walter on the porch swing in silences that no longer felt peaceful but heavy, weighted with everything unspoken between them. She found herself Googling Holloway Freight Solutions late at night while Walter slept, scrolling through old archive news articles about its dramatic rise and its scandalous boardroom coup, staring at photographs of a much younger Walter, sharper-jawed, dark-haired, dressed in expensive suits, standing at podiums with the easy confidence of a man who believed the world was entirely his to shape. She barely recognized him. And yet, looking closer at the photographs, she began to notice something familiar in his eyes even then, a gentleness, a warmth, that no amount of wealth or status had ever fully covered up. It was the same warmth she saw every morning when he handed her a cup of tea. She spoke with her sister Louise about it, carefully, without revealing details Walter hadn't given her permission to share, and Louise, to Margaret's surprise, had been the one to say something that stuck with her for days afterward. "Maggie," Louise had said, "you've spent 11 years feeling like you settled for a janitor when really you'd been secretly living with a man who chose humility after the world tried to break him. That's not a lesser man. That might honestly be the strongest man I've ever heard of." Margaret had cried after that conversation, not from sadness exactly, but from the dizzying realization that her perspective on her entire marriage was shifting beneath her feet, reforming into something new and unexpectedly beautiful. Meanwhile, word of what had happened in the lobby of Ashford Tower had begun to spread, as these things inevitably do in a building full of people hungry for gossip. Within days, it seemed like half the company knew that the quiet, aging janitor who cleaned their floors every night was somehow personally connected to CEO Bradley Kensington in a way nobody could quite explain. Rumors swirled. Some said Walter was a disgraced former executive being punished, others whispered that he was secretly an undercover investor keeping tabs on the company, and one particularly imaginative junior analyst insisted Walter must be Bradley Kensington's biological father, hiding out for mysterious reasons. Walter, for his part, continued showing up to work exactly as he always had, mopping the same floors, polishing the same brass fixtures, offering the same quiet, polite nod to everyone he passed, seemingly unbothered by the whispers trailing in his wake, though Margaret could tell, in the small ways only a wife of 11 years could notice, that the sudden attention weighed on him. The truth fully came to light 2 weeks later, in a manner nobody, least of all Walter, had anticipated. Bradley Kensington, it turned out, had been quietly planning something for months, something he had never discussed with Walter beforehand, out of respect for what he understood to be his old mentor's fierce desire for privacy. Ashford Global Enterprises was preparing to launch a massive new logistics and supply chain division, expanding aggressively into an area of the market that happened to be exactly the specialty Walter had built Holloway Freight Solutions around decades earlier. Bradley had spent the past several years quietly absorbing every ounce of wisdom Walter was willing to share during their early morning conversations, and he had come to a decision he felt was long overdue. He wanted Walter to lead the new division, not as some symbolic gesture, but because Bradley genuinely believed, with complete conviction, that nobody in the company, nobody in the entire industry, in his estimation, understood supply chain logistics and ethical leadership better than Walter Whitfield did. Bradley called a company-wide meeting, held in the grand atrium of Ashford Tower rather than a private boardroom, specifically so that every employee, from senior executives to the newest hires, could witness what he was about to do. Margaret, invited by Bradley himself through a call that left her hands shaking as she held the phone, stood near the front of the crowd beside her niece Eleanor, watching as Walter, dressed not in his janitorial uniform but in a simple, well-fitted charcoal suit that Bradley's own assistant had quietly arranged for him, walked up to the small stage that had been set up near the fountain. Bradley Kensington stood beside him, and before the assembled crowd of nearly 1,000 employees, he told them the truth, not every private detail, because those belonged to Walter and Walter alone, but enough. He told them about Holloway Freight Solutions, about the company Walter had built from a single napkin sketch into an industry leader, about the personal tragedy that had cost him everything, and about the quiet, humble grace with which Walter had rebuilt his life from the ground up, choosing dignity over bitterness, choosing to mop floors rather than wallow in what had been stolen from him. "I have met a lot of successful people in my career," Bradley said, his voice carrying clearly through the atrium, thick with an emotion he made no effort to hide, "but I have never met anyone with more integrity than the man standing beside me right now. This man taught me everything I know about real leadership, back when I was a scared kid barely out of business school, and he has continued teaching me, quietly, humbly, every single week for the past 6 years, never once asking for recognition or credit. Today, that changes. Effective immediately, Walter Whitfield will be leading our new logistics division as executive vice president, and frankly, this company is lucky to have him." The atrium erupted into applause, a wave of sound that rolled through the vast glass-ceilinged space, and Margaret watched her husband stand on that small stage, visibly overwhelmed, his eyes searching the crowd until they found hers. And in that moment, watching him find her face among 1,000 strangers, Margaret understood something with a clarity that settled deep into her bones. This was still the same man she had married 11 years ago. The suit was different. The title was different. But the eyes, the gentle, humble warmth behind them, had never changed at all. If this story has touched something in you so far, I want to ask you to pause for just a moment and leave a comment below about what this story means to you. Maybe it's about the danger of hiding our true selves from the people who love us, or maybe it's about how humility and hardship can build a kind of strength that success never could, or maybe you simply want to share a moment when someone in your own life turned out to be so much more than you ever realized. Whatever it is, I would love to hear it, because these comments are what keep our community strong, and they remind all of us why stories about kindness and second chances matter so much in a world that so often forgets to slow down and really see people. In the weeks that followed, Margaret and Walter's marriage entered a season of rebuilding that was, in its own way, more tender and more honest than anything they had experienced in their first 11 years together. Walter began, slowly and carefully, to tell her everything, not in one overwhelming confession, but in small pieces over quiet dinners and long walks, filling in the gaps of the man he had been before she knew him. He told her about Deborah, about the particular ache of watching someone you love fade day by day while feeling powerless to stop it, and Margaret listened without jealousy, understanding instinctively that loving Deborah's memory did not diminish Walter's love for her, but rather deepened her understanding of the man capable of loving so completely. He told her about Reginald Cole's betrayal, about the sick feeling of watching people he had trusted for years quietly turn against him the moment he showed vulnerability, and Margaret finally understood the roots of Walter's quiet, careful nature, his reluctance to fully open up even to the people closest to him. For her part, Margaret confessed her own shame too, the uncomfortable truth of that Christmas party years ago, the small ugly feelings she had buried and never told anyone about, the way she had sometimes wondered, in her weakest moments, whether she deserved more than a life spent budgeting carefully around a janitor's modest salary. Walter listened to her confession with a tenderness that surprised her, taking her hand and telling her that her feelings, however uncomfortable, were human, and that the fact she had never once let those feelings change how she treated him said more about her character than the feelings themselves ever could. "You loved me anyway," he said simply. "Even when some part of you wished I was different, you never once made me feel less than. That's not shame, Maggie. That's grace." Their new financial circumstances brought their own complicated adjustments. Walter's new position came with a salary that, combined with the substantial equity stake Bradley insisted on including as part of the offer, transformed their lives almost overnight from modest comfort into genuine wealth. Margaret found herself uncomfortable at first with the idea of a bigger house, of nicer things, feeling almost guilty enjoying comforts that had come, in some sense, from a tragedy that predated her entirely. But Walter, in one of the more profound conversations of their marriage, told her that he didn't see this new chapter as reclaiming what he'd lost, but as an entirely new opportunity to build something meaningful with the woman who had loved him through the leanest years without ever once making him feel small for it. "This money doesn't belong to the man I used to be," he told her one evening as they sat together reviewing Bradley's formal offer letter. "It belongs to us, to the family we've built, to the years you stood by me not knowing any of this was coming. I want to build something new, Maggie, not resurrect something old." Together, they made a decision that surprised almost everyone who knew them, including Bradley Kensington himself. Rather than moving into some opulent new home in the city's wealthiest neighborhood, Walter and Margaret chose instead to stay in their modest house, the one where they had built 11 years of quiet, ordinary happiness, though they did finally fix the leaking roof and replace the ancient furnace that had struggled through every winter for as long as they'd lived there. Instead of spending extravagantly on themselves, they established a foundation, quietly, without press releases or public fanfare, the way Walter did everything, dedicated to helping displaced and struggling workers rebuild their lives and careers after devastating personal losses, exactly the kind of support Walter wished had existed for him during his darkest months after Deborah's death. They funded job retraining programs, provided emergency grants for medical expenses that threatened to bankrupt working families, and created scholarships for the children of essential workers, the janitors, the cafeteria staff, the security guards, the people, Walter often said, who kept the world running while remaining almost entirely invisible to the people they served. Margaret found herself, for the first time in her life, working alongside her husband in a meaningful capacity, helping manage the foundation's outreach efforts, meeting with families in situations achingly similar to what Walter had once faced. She discovered a strength and capability in herself that surprised her, a natural talent for connecting with people who felt invisible, perhaps because she understood, now more than ever, that dignity had nothing to do with job titles or bank account balances. She thought often, during those months, about how close she had come to letting her own quiet shame poison something precious, how easily resentment could have crept into her marriage if she had allowed those small ugly feelings to fester rather than simply loving Walter through them. Word of Walter's story eventually made its way beyond the walls of Ashford Tower, first through a modest profile in a regional business publication, and then, somewhat to Walter's discomfort, through a larger feature that caught the attention of national media, drawn to the almost cinematic drama of a disgraced former CEO who had spent years secretly mentoring a rising executive while working nights as a janitor. Walter, uncomfortable with the sudden attention, agreed to only a handful of interviews, always steering the conversation away from himself and toward the foundation's work, toward the dignity of labor, toward the message he seemed to genuinely believe in his bones, that no job, however humble, ever diminished a person's worth, and that the truest measure of character revealed itself not in how people treated you when you had power, but in how you treated others when you had none. One particular afternoon, several months after the truth had first come to light, Margaret found herself back in the lobby of Ashford Tower, waiting for Walter to finish a late meeting so they could go to dinner together, a small ritual they developed to celebrate the small anniversary of the day everything had changed. She sat on the same marble bench where she had once sat frozen with shock, watching the same fountain trickle water over the same smooth black stones, and she noticed something that made her smile through unexpected tears. Near the east wall, where Walter had once knelt polishing brass fixtures in obscurity, there was now a small brass plaque, simple and unassuming, that Bradley Kensington had personally commissioned without telling Walter beforehand. It read, "To every person who does honest work with quiet dignity, unseen and unthanked, this building stands because of you." Margaret learned later that Walter had wept when he first saw it, standing alone in the lobby before his old shift would have started, overwhelmed by a recognition he had spent years believing he neither wanted nor deserved. Their marriage, tested and cracked open by revelation, had not simply survived the ordeal but had transformed into something Margaret could genuinely say was stronger and more honest than anything she had known before. She and Walter began a practice, born from the painful lessons of that spring, of sharing one true thing with each other every single evening, not necessarily a secret or a confession, but simply something real, something they might otherwise have kept quietly to themselves out of habit or fear or the simple human instinct to protect the people we love from our messier, more complicated truths. Some evenings the shared truth was small, a worry about aging parents, a frustration from the day, a memory triggered unexpectedly by something as simple as a song on the radio. Other evenings the truths ran deeper, touching old wounds that took years to fully surface. But the practice itself became sacred to both of them, a small nightly ritual that ensured the silence which had once nearly cost them everything would never again be allowed to grow unchecked between them. Walter's relationship with Bradley Kensington deepened as well, evolving from its secretive, almost furtive early morning meetings into an open, celebrated mentorship that Bradley credited publicly, at every opportunity, as the foundation of his own success. Under Walter's leadership, the new logistics division exceeded every projection within its first year, not merely through operational efficiency but through a company culture Walter insisted on building from the ground up, one that treated every employee, from the loading dock workers to the senior executives, with the same fundamental respect. He instituted policies ensuring warehouse workers received meaningful profit sharing, established mental health support programs after quietly recognizing how many employees carried invisible struggles behind professional smiles, exactly the way he once had. He became known throughout the company not as a former disgraced CEO reclaiming lost glory, but as something rarer and more valuable, a leader who genuinely remembered what it felt like to be overlooked, and who structured an entire division around never letting anyone else feel that particular loneliness if he could help it. Margaret's relationship with her sister Louise, too, found its own quiet healing. Louise, initially awkward and overly effusive once the truth about Walter's past became public, gradually settled into a more genuine, less performative relationship with her brother-in-law, one built less on impressed admiration for his eventual success and more on an appreciation Margaret had always wished her family could extend to Walter from the very beginning, simply for the quality of his character. During one particularly meaningful conversation the following winter, Louise apologized to Margaret, unprompted, for that long-ago Christmas party comment, admitting that she had genuinely never considered how deeply those careless words might have wounded her sister, and Margaret, in turn, found herself finally able to release the shame she had carried privately for years, understanding at last that the judgment she had feared from others had never been worth the quiet suffering it caused her. Perhaps the most profound transformation, though, was the one that occurred within Margaret herself. She began to understand, in the months following that shocking day in the lobby, that her own capacity for love had been larger and more resilient than she had ever given herself credit for. She had loved Walter fully as a janitor, without knowing anything about the empire he had built and lost, without knowing about the tragedy that had reshaped him into the humble, gentle man she had married. And she came to realize that this, loving someone completely, without needing to know the full scope of their history, without requiring status or achievement as proof of their worth, was perhaps the truest and rarest form of love a person could offer another human being. She had given Walter that gift without even realizing its magnitude, and in receiving it, Walter had finally found the safety to become whole again, to step fully back into the light after years of hiding in the comfortable shadows of anonymity. On the one-year anniversary of that fateful morning in the Ashford Tower lobby, Walter surprised Margaret with a quiet dinner, not at some extravagant new restaurant befitting his current position, but at the same modest Italian place they had frequented during their leanest years, the one with the wobbly tables and the owner who still remembered their names and their usual order. Over glasses of inexpensive but perfectly good red wine, Walter took Margaret's hand across the table and told her something that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. "I used to think," he said, "that the worst thing that ever happened to me was losing everything, my wife, my company, my sense of who I was. For years, I believed that story completely. But I've realized something this past year, Maggie, something I don't think I could have understood any other way. Losing everything is what led me to you. If I had still been that man in the expensive suits, running that company, I never would have gone to your cousin's barbecue in a flannel shirt with cleaning supplies in my truck. I never would have met a woman who asked me if I liked dogs and thunderstorms instead of asking about my career. Losing everything didn't ruin my life. It cleared away everything false so that something real could finally grow. And that real thing, that true thing, has been you, all along. Margaret cried at the table, unashamed, and reached across to hold her husband's weathered hands in both of hers, the same hands that had once polished brass fixtures in obscurity and that had also, decades earlier, signed contracts worth millions of dollars, hands that had built something extraordinary, lost it entirely, and rebuilt something even more extraordinary from nothing but humility and quiet integrity. She thought about the frightened, uncertain woman who had sat frozen on that marble bench a year earlier, watching her entire understanding of her marriage crack open in an instant, and she felt a deep, settled gratitude for the journey that had followed, not despite the pain of that revelation, but because of everything that pain had ultimately taught them both about honesty, about grace, and about the particular, hard-won strength required to love someone through every version of who they had been and every version they might yet become. If this story touched your heart even a little, I want to ask you, sincerely, to like this video, to leave a meaningful comment sharing what part of this journey resonated most with you, to share this story with someone in your life who might need a reminder today that dignity has nothing to do with job titles, and that second chances are always possible even after devastating loss. And please, subscribe to our channel, because our community exists to tell stories exactly like this one, stories about kindness, about forgiveness, about the quiet, unglamorous courage it takes to rebuild a life from nothing and still choose humility over bitterness. We believe, in our family here on this channel, that the most extraordinary people are often the ones the world overlooks entirely, and we will keep telling their stories for as long as you keep showing up to listen. Years later, Walter would occasionally return to Ashford Tower's lobby on quiet weekend mornings, long before the building filled with its usual rush of employees, and he would stand for a while near that small brass plaque on the east wall, remembering the man he had once been kneeling there in obscurity, polishing brass fixtures with a soft cloth, believing that the quietest possible life was the only life he could survive. He never regretted those years of hiding, because he understood now that they had been necessary, a kind of chrysalis he had needed to heal inside of before he could emerge again into the light. And every time he stood there, remembering, he would eventually feel a familiar hand slip into his. Margaret, who still, even after everything, insisted on visiting him for lunch sometimes, still treated him with the same unpretentious warmth she had shown him back when she believed he was nothing more than a humble janitor with clean hands and a good heart. Because that, in the end, was the truest thing about Walter Whitfield, the thing that had never changed no matter how many titles came and went, no matter how much wealth he gained or lost or gained again. He had always been a man with clean hands and a good heart, and Margaret had always loved him exactly for that, long before she ever knew there was anything else to love him for. And perhaps that, more than any title, any company, any fortune rebuilt from the ashes of devastating loss, was the truest measure of a life well lived, not what the world called you, but who you remained, quietly and consistently, when you believed nobody important was watching at all.